Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, and we are continuing our conversations with luminaries and influencers and people making an impact in the world. And this is part of our continuing series on what we're calling conversations between science and spirituality, scientists and sages, or whatever you want to call it. So today, my very special guest is a very good friend of mine. I've known him since, I should say, since the early mid 80s.
Oh, I thought you were going to talk about several lifetimes ago, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's also okay. Uh, Another conversation. So we've known each other for a long time. I remember his bestseller when I was still in my early writing phases. Eat More, Way Less.
Oh, that was a while ago.
Remarkable book. So thank you for joining me, Dean.
It's a great pleasure to be with you anytime.
So all our friends will see your bio and everything else linked to the books and all that afterwards. After we finish the conversation, it'll be everywhere. And by the time 2 or 3 months have gone by, we should have reached 15 million people. So thank you for joining me.
It's a great
Um,
opportunity. Thank you.
Dean, most of my audience actually knows us, but a lot don't. So let's start from the beginning a little bit, where you grew up, what your early influences were, your interest with yoga and meditation with Swami Sachidananda, your medical education, and how we got to be where we are. So take your time. We'll say 5 minutes or plus.
Sure.
So at least people get to know you as a person, not as this famous guy.
Sure. Well, again, I appreciate the chance to be here with you always and to raise awareness. As you know, awareness is always the first step in healing. So thank you for this great opportunity to be of service in such a meaningful way. Long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky. No, no, sorry, that was someone else. Um, I, uh, I was born in Texas, where shit is a three-syllable word, and went to Baylor College of Medicine. Graduated from the University of Texas in Austin. Um, Actually started out at Rice University in Houston and got profoundly and suicidally depressed. That was really the doorway for me, my spiritual awakening. And it's a long story, which I wrote about in a couple of my earlier books. But the short version is I had kind of a double whammy of feeling like I was stupid and somehow I just managed to fool the admissions committee that I was worthy of being admitted. And now that I was with a bunch of really smart kids, it was just a matter of time before they realized what a big mistake they'd made in letting me in. But worse than that, I had a bona fide spiritual vision, which was more than I could handle as a freshman in college, which was that nothing can bring lasting happiness. And I thought, wow, I mean, I was told just, get into medical school and get rich and famous and, all the things that our culture teaches us, and then you'll be happy. Then people will love you and then you'll be good. And I just knew that wasn't true. And so the combination of feeling like I was never going to amount to anything because I was stupid, but even if I did, it wouldn't matter anyway. I thought, well, just like, why don't I just kill myself? Dead people look like they're peaceful. And I couldn't even sit still. I was so agitated. So I was all set to do that. And then I got so profoundly sick with mononucleosis that I literally couldn't get out of bed. That was really what saved my life. My parents came down, saw what a wreck I was, and I went home to Dallas to recuperate. And my plan was to get well enough, strong enough to kill myself, as crazy as that sounds. And that was in 1972. And my older sister had studied yoga with Sri Swami Satchidananda, who came here in 1966 with Peter Max, the artist, opened Woodstock, and was a well-known spiritual teacher, and he really helped her a lot. So my parents decided to have a cocktail party for the Swami in their home in North Dallas, which was really weird, as you can imagine. I mean, today it'd be weird in Dallas, but it was especially weird back then. And so there's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and that was certainly true for me. And in walks this very central castings idea of what a Swami should look like, sannyasin, long saffron robes and long white beard and all of that. And he sat down in our living room to give a satsang, and he started off by saying, "Nothing can bring you lasting happiness," which I'd already figured out, except I was ready to do myself in, and he's glowing. Like, what am I missing here? And he went on to say what probably sounds like a new age cliche to some people, but it really turned my life around, which is that nothing can bring lasting happiness, but we have it already. And that not being mindful of that, we end up running after all these things. If only I had more money, more power, more sex, more beauty, more accomplishment, whatever, then I'd be happy. Then people would love me. Then I wouldn't feel so lonely and isolated. Once you set up that view of the world, he said, however, it turns out you lose, because if you don't get it, you lose. If someone else gets it, then you feel really bad. And even if you get it, it's very seductive in the moment because it makes you think that, now I got it, now I'm happy, but it doesn't last. It's either now what, it doesn't provide it's never enough. One patient later in life told me, he said, I can't even enjoy the view from the mountain I've climbed. I'm already looking over the next one. It's never enough. Or if it's not now what, so what? Big deal. It doesn't really provide that lasting sense of meaning and purpose. And so not being aware of that, we end up saying, well, this didn't do it, maybe that will. And so we have a project, a dozen projects going at the same time. So I thought, okay, well, let me give this weird stuff a try. And I can always go to plan B. I'll move killing myself down to plan B. And I began trying these things and I got glimpses of what that meant to feel more peaceful. Again, not because I got something I thought I needed, but rather, at least temporarily, I wasn't disturbing what was there already. Now, to some people, that may sound like a lot of parsing of words and semantics and, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and so on. But the implications are really quite profound, as you know, because if it's out there, then everyone who has what I think I need has power over me. If it's me, then I can do something about that, not to blame myself, but to empower it. And as you well know, and as you've written about so beautifully and eloquently in your many books and in your lectures and all of that, that the ancient swamis and rabbis and priests and monks and nuns and spiritual teachers didn't develop meditation to unclog your arteries or lower your blood pressure or do better in sports or in school. It can certainly help do all those things. They're really powerful tools for transformation, for quieting down our mind and bodies enough to experience that inner sense of peace and well-being. And if you take it even further, that inner wisdom, that guru within, the God within, that wise, still small voice within, that speaks very quietly, but very clearly, but very quietly, gets drowned out by the chat of everyday life. And we can access that more directly. So I went from not being able to read a headline on a newspaper and tell you, a minute later what it said, went back to school, graduated first in my class, gave the baccalaureate. And I say that not to brag, but to say I experienced both ends of that spectrum, that when I really thought I had to do and get all these things in order to be happy, I couldn't function at all. I was ready to do myself in. But when I was more inwardly defined, and it's not all or nothing, but even moments of glimpses of that, it really took a lot of the stresses out of that and enabled me to function at a much higher level. And so when I went to medical school and I was learning how to do bypass surgery with Michael DeBakey, the heart surgeon who had been one of the inventors of bypass surgery, it became a metaphor of an incomplete approach that we were literally bypassing the problem. We weren't treating the cause. So we'd cut people open, we'd bypass their clogged arteries, he'd tell them they were cured. And they go home and eat junk food and smoke cigarettes and not manage stress, not exercise, have dysfunctional relationships. And often their bypasses would clog up. We'd cut them open again, sometimes multiple times. So that set me on my life's work, which was I took a year off between my second and third years of medical school to do this pilot study of 10 people who had really bad heart disease, put them in a hotel for a month. And after a month, 8 of the 10 got better. And they not only felt better, but they were better. We actually showed that the blood flow to their heart improved in eight of the 10 people. But I had no control group. And so, people would say, well, it's only 10 people. And how do you know they wouldn't have gotten better anyway? And I'd say, well, that's theoretically true, but how often do you see patients with heart disease get better like this? Well, that's beside the point. So I went back to school, finished medical school, did a randomized trial of about a month long again, showed the same results, published that in the Journal of the AMA, went to Boston to do my medical residency and fellowship, moved to San Francisco, began the most definitive study called the Lifestyle Heart Trial. And I think in all of our studies, we've been using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove how powerful these very low-tech and low-cost and often ancient interventions can be. And the more diseases we study, the more evidence we have to show what a powerful difference these simple changes can make and how quickly we can measure improvement. So we showed for the first time that these same lifestyle changes, eat well, a whole foods plant-based diet that's low in fat and sugar, eat well, move more, moderate exercise, stress less, meditation and yoga, and love more, social support, could reverse and therefore prevent the most common chronic disease. We showed heart disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, early stage prostate cancer. We did a study showing we could, for the first time, that we could increase telomerase and lengthen telomeres with Liz Blackburn, who I know you've done studies with after that, showing that we could actually, when we published that in the Lancet, the editors called it reversing aging at a cellular level. We published a study with Craig Venter showing that over 500 genes can change in just 3 months, turning on the genes that keep us healthy, turning off the genes that promote heart disease, type 2 diabetes, all these conditions. And we're now in the midst of the first randomized trial to see if these same lifestyle changes can reverse early stage Alzheimer's disease. And I think we're at a place with Alzheimer's very reminiscent of where we were with heart disease. And I wrote a book with my wife, Ann, called Undo It, which is here. It's actually a play on my teacher, Swami Satchidananda, liked to make puns. And people would say, "What are you, a Hindu?" He'd say, "No, I'm an undu," and it's an homage to that, And also my favorite key on the computer has always been the undo button. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had one in our lives? And it puts forth this, what I thought was a radical unifying theory that I thought I get a lot of pushback from it. It's actually been amazingly well embraced. I'm writing it up for JAMA now. That I was taught, like I'm sure you were and all doctors were, that heart disease and diabetes and prostate cancer and Alzheimer's and so on are different diseases, different diagnoses, and different treatments. And yet over the 43 years we've been doing these studies, it was the same lifestyle intervention that we found could stop or reverse the progression of all these different conditions. And I thought, well, why is that? And then it kind of hit me like, oh, I get it. They're really not so different. That they have more in common than they are different. They're the same, in many respects, the same disease, manifesting and masquerading in different forms, because they all share the same underlying biological mechanisms. Things like chronic inflammation, changes in telomeres and gene expression, and angiogenesis and apoptosis, and immune function, overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. And each of these mechanisms is directly influenced by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and how much love and support we have. And the more diseases we study, the more evidence we have to show that. And that sort of radically simplifies what we tell people. One of the Undo It books begins with one of my favorite quotes, which is from Albert Einstein. He said, if you can't make it simple, you don't understand it well enough. That's part of what you do so well, Deepak, in your writings, is to take these very esoteric teachings and really make them simple. This is what my teacher did, Swami Satchidananda, as well. And so I tried to take that approach in the book to say, look, you can go as deep into the complexity of this as you want, but it's really quite simple. To the degree that you make these changes, there's a corresponding benefit. And it's ounce of prevention and pound of cure. The reason we were the first to show that we could reverse all these different conditions is that it's hard to reverse a chronic disease. It takes a lot. It's the pound of cure, if you will. Most people don't go far enough. And I think the same is true for Alzheimer's. Back 43 years ago in 1977, when I did my first study, we used, the control group of our studies were on the moderate changes that most doctors recommend, the American Heart Association diet, for example. We found that to get reversal, it had to be much more intensive. And I think Alzheimer's is the same way. Back then, 43 years ago, less intensive lifestyle intervention slowed the rate at which our arteries got clogged. We found that a more intensive intervention could actually reverse even severely clogged arteries became measurably less clogged. And I think the same is true for Alzheimer's, that less intensive lifestyle interventions slow the rate at which you get worse. We think a more intensive one might actually stop or reverse it. And in some ways, Alzheimer's is even more important because, first of all, my mom died of Alzheimer's, all of her siblings. I have one of the ApoE4 genes. I have a high risk for it. And it was really tragic seeing my brilliant mom's mind decay like that. But also, at least with other diseases, there are other treatments that have some benefit. There are drugs, there are surgical procedures, and so on. But nothing works with Alzheimer's. They've done 400 drug trials in the last 17 years at a cost of $15 billion. And not a single drug has been approved or works. That at best, the drugs slow down the rate at which you get worse. So when someone gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's an incredibly isolating and depressing experience because they're invariably told, I'm sorry, Mr. Jones or Ms. Smith, you've got Alzheimer's. It's only going to get worse. At best, you can slow down the rate at which you get worse. Get your affairs in order. If there's anything you want to do in life, do it now. You don't have much time. So they get in this downward spiral of thinking, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. And their world starts to contract. They don't want to go out because they don't want to embarrass themselves because they forget stuff. Next thing they know, the doctor is telling them they've got Alzheimer's. And by the way, we're going to take away your driver's license. So now your world shrinks even more. And it becomes self-fulfilling in a negative way. And one of the reasons I've spent so much of my adult life doing these research studies, and they're really hard to do. It's hard to do because everything we've done, people thought was impossible before we did it. And it's hard to raise funds to do a study that people think is going to fail. And it's a catch-22. Without the funds, you can't show it works. And if they don't think it's going to work, they don't want to fund it. But to me, that's always what makes it exciting, because if we do show, and if we, as we have in the past, we can redefine what's possible for people, then it can give literally millions of people new hope and new choices. And I can't really talk about what we're finding yet with the Alzheimer's study, but I'm very optimistic by what we're seeing so far. But if we show, and it's a big if, this could be the most important work because nothing else does work. And if we find something as simple as lifestyle changes can actually reverse it, then it probably takes even less to prevent it in the first place.
So my very special guest is Dr. Dean Ornish. You can see his book there, Undo It, How to Reverse not only heart disease, but many other diseases that you just heard about, Alzheimer's, possibly prostate cancer, and others. So Dean, I have a few questions. One is that only in the last few years, I became aware, thanks to my association with Rudy Tanzi, that less than 5% of disease related gene mutations are fully penetrant. In fact, he says maybe 3%, not even 5%. And that means if you have a BRCA gene or something like that, you guarantees the disease. But that's 3% of all disease. The rest is related to factors that you've mentioned. But then, of course, now as you watch the news, all this talk about CRISPR and this and that, and even CRISPR, where we'll be able to cut and paste genes, will actually only dramatically affect the 3% fully penetrant genes. It doesn't alter the fact that most chronic disease is not affected by these gene mutations because they're not fully penetrant. In fact, of the 40 or so Alzheimer's genes, a lot of which Rudy has identified, he says only 2 or 3 are fully penetrant and the others not. So my question to you is the following. Um, you've shown this very clearly. You're the earliest person to show this, the first person to show this. But now as I look at the literature, some time ago, one of the R&D people for the biggest drug companies came and met me in Aspen at one of those Aspen brain conferences. And he was saying that quite accidentally, they found that people who had vagal implants for, say, intractable epilepsy, and they put some electrode in the vagus nerve, stimulated with a handheld device electrically, and for intractable asthma. But as they noticed that people who had those implants, their asthma was reversing or their rheumatoid arthritis was going away. So they were starting a whole new company as part of this big multinational conglomerate, looking for what he called electroceuticals instead of pharmaceuticals. Basic idea is to put vagal implants and stimulate them different branches of the vagus nerve. And I told him we can stimulate vagus through yoga, through
Meditation, yeah.
meditation, through chanting, through deep breathing, to even singing, through mind-body coordination. And each of the yoga asanas goes to different branches of the vagus nerve. He said, we know all that, but how do we make money with that? So and that was the conversation. But the reason I'm bringing up this conversation with you right now is to ask you some questions and get some clarity for our audience.
Sure.
What I'm being told is that almost every chronic disease, other than the fully penetrant genes, is preceded for maybe even a decade or more by low-grade inflammation, which is also associated with low-grade anxiety and depression, sometimes even called unexplained anxiety, free-floating anxiety. You and I might think of it as existential anxiety that you had as a student, but never mind. There's low-grade anxiety, low-grade depression, low-grade inflammation, and it takes years, 10, 20 years to get heart disease, Alzheimer's, what have you. And by the time you get it, then, you put somebody on Lipitor or something like that. And it's very silly that we don't actually intervene now. So that's one question. Is it true that low-grade inflammation and low-grade anxiety, we did a meta-analysis through our foundation. We did confirm that low-grade anxiety, low-grade depression, and inflammation precede chronic illness by many years, and you can intervene and prevent that. The other thing I want to ask you is what you've shown for prostate should apply to asthma, should apply to rheumatoid arthritis, should apply to autoimmune illness, should apply to psoriasis, should apply to, I guess, every chronic disease, because as you said, the underlying factors are the same. It just means somebody is predisposed to this or that because of genetic activity, or you might say epigenetic modulation. Genes are not nouns, they are verbs, and they respond to every experience that we have. So, are we seeing a future? And this is what I want to ask. Because as we speak right now, I'm engaged in creating new algorithms with certain technology companies that look at facial expressions, eye movements, tone of voice, micro expressions of the face, body language, gestures, mood, and then correlate that with immune function, heart rate variability, etc. So one day we'll have a selfie instead of a selfie, take a 15-second video and get a pretty good idea in real time what's happening in your body and how you can intervene. So a lot from me, but from my friends, I hear that even people who are susceptible to cancer, they benefit. Sometimes they go into remission. Not that we don't recommend standard chemotherapy or radiation. It works, but it also doesn't work. In many cases, it's inappropriate. I've known many people who have died of side effects rather than of the disease that they call cancer, which is not one disease, but many diseases. So I'll stop there. I'd love to hear your feedback.
Okay, well, you've covered a lot of stuff. So I hope if I forget any of it, please bring me back.
Yeah, yeah.
I think these mechanisms go in both directions, and I'm continually impressed by how dynamic they are and how quickly you can get better or worse to the degree that you make or don't make certain changes. In the case of inflammation and anxiety, inflammation causes anxiety, and anxiety causes inflammation. It kind of goes round and round. And inflammation is one of many mechanisms that you find in most of these chronic diseases. Chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the microbiome, and telomeres, and gene expression, and angiogenesis, and apoptosis, and immune function, and vagus nerve, overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. As you know, the vagus is the parasympathetic, the corollary to that. And so it's the same disease manifesting in all these different forms. It's why you often see that the same person will have what we call comorbidities. They'll have high blood pressure and high cholesterol and be overweight and have type 2 diabetes and have heart disease. Or you'll find whole countries, in Asia, until about 1950 or so, they had extremely low rates of all these chronic conditions. And as they start to eat like us and live like us, now they die like us and they get the same conditions that we do. The genes didn't change in the last 100 years, but their lifestyles do. And yet at the same time, our genes are not our fate. Our genes are a predisposition, but our genes are not our fate. I've been working with Bill Clinton for many years, since 1993 as one of his doctors. And about 14 years ago, his bypasses clogged up. His cardiologist went on CNN and said, oh, it was all in his genes. His diet and lifestyle really didn't have anything to do with it. And having worked with him for so many years, I knew it had everything to do with it. So I sent him a note and I said, look, you're one of the most powerful guys in the world, but if it's all in your genes, then you're just a victim. You're not a victim. You're a powerful guy. And I figured, the people I appreciate the most are the ones who tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear. So I figured he needed to hear that, and I might not ever hear from him again. But he called me, and a few days later we met, and he made these lifestyle changes. He's been doing it now for about 14 years. He's talked publicly. His disease is getting better. It's because of that. So our genes are not our fate. But if your mother and your father and your sister and your brother and your aunts and uncles all died early from heart disease, you have a higher risk, but it's not a death sentence. It just means that you probably need to make bigger changes to prevent it than someone else who doesn't have those genes. And as I mentioned briefly, I published a paper with Craig Venter 15 or 20 years ago showing that these same lifestyle changes, that over 500 genes were changed in just 3 months of making these same changes, turning on upregulating the genes that keep us healthy, downregulating the genes that cause all these same mechanisms we've been talking about, as well as downregulating the oncogenes that promote the RAS oncogenes that promote prostate, breast, and colon cancer. We did a randomized trial with Peter Carroll when he was chair of urology at UCSF and Bill Fair when he was chair of urology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, that these same lifestyle changes could slow, stop, and even reverse the progression of early stage prostate cancer. Now, prostate cancer is an interesting disease because most men, if you live long enough, are going to get it, but you're more likely to die from something else. You're more likely to die with prostate cancer than from it. There were two large scale 10-year trials in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they both showed the same thing about 1 out of 50, 1 out of 49 or 50 men who has early stage prostate cancer and has surgery or radiation actually lives longer because of the treatments. The other 49 often get maimed in the most personal ways. They're often either impotent or incontinent or both for no real benefit at huge economic and personal costs. But if the only choice they're given is between doing something and nothing, and the something is either surgery or radiation or nothing, most people don't want to do nothing because they like, we're guys who want to do something, right? Want to get that tumor out of me that's growing, and yet the treatment is often worse than disease. So now people have a third alternative under their doctor's supervision. If they're willing to make these intensive lifestyle changes, they can monitor them. And in most cases, they can avoid having surgery that they otherwise might have. Same with type 2 diabetes. Getting your blood sugar down with drugs prevents the horrible complications of type 2 diabetes, amputations and impotence and heart attacks and strokes and kidney failure and so on, way better than getting it down with drugs does. And the same with heart disease. There are now 8 randomized trials showing that in men and women who have stable heart disease, that stents and angioplasties really don't work. They don't they don't make you live longer. They don't prevent heart attacks. They don't even reduce angina. And yet we spent $50 billion last year on these interventions that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and largely ineffective. And we're getting better and better at, like, there now is a blood test. You can detect amyloid in your blood 20 years before it becomes clinically apparent. And yet a lot of people don't want to know. It's like, why would I want to know if I'm going to get a bad disease that I can't do anything about? I'm just going to it'll make me crazy, James Watson Watson and Crick was one of the first people to get his genome sequenced. He said, I want to know everything except the ApoE4 gene, the gene that controls my risk of Alzheimer's, because why would I want to know if I can't do anything about it? And that's why I love doing these studies, because it can really, if done properly, and if we continue to show what I'm hoping we'll show, can redefine what's possible and give millions of people new hope and new choices. We're collaborating with Rudy Tanzi. He's doing the inflammatory biomarkers on our study. We had to virtualize our intervention a year ago when COVID came. We were meeting with people 3 times a week for 4 hours at a time in person. And we had to do that all by Zoom, and it's worked amazingly well. So we now actually be recruiting people from other sites, like at Harvard. Well, they'll do the testing and the recruitment there. We'll do the intervention from here. It's kind of opened up a whole new way of working with people. And like you say, with the vagus nerve, yeah, I mean, it's gotten to the point where, I remember, Medicare created a new benefit category to cover my reversing heart disease program. It took 16 years, and that was with the support of Bill Clinton when he was president and Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker of the House. Not a whole lot of things they agreed on. 20 members of the Senate, almost 40 members of the House, from the most liberal Democrats to the most conservative Republicans. One of the few things because these are just human issues. And about, 10 or 11 years into that, the head of Medicare at the time, a guy named Bruce Laddick, said, okay, well, we might cover it, but you have to get a letter from the head of the National Institutes of Health, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, that it's safe for older people to walk, meditate, eat vegetables, and quit smoking. Compared to, I said, you mean compared to getting your chest cut open? He goes, no, that these are not high risk behaviors for older people. I said, you must be joking. And he wasn't. We actually had to do a formal literature review that these are not, unhealthy things. So we've gotten to this point where, stimulating your vagus nerve by implanting something in your brain, that's conventional medicine because it's reimbursable. And yet, meditating to stimulate your vagus nerve is radical. But that's why it was so important. That's why I spent 16 years of my life. And it's not even like, it's going to be 16 years. It's like in year 15, you're going like, is this ever going to happen? But it was worth it, because if you change reimbursement, you change medical practice and medical education. And that equation that the guy said, look, the device is covered, but the meditation is not. Now Medicare is, and many of the major insurance companies are paying for our program, which includes meditation and yoga. I mean, who would have thought that would have been the case 20 years ago?
A very special guest is Dr. Dean Ornish. You can see his book, Undo It, Reversing Chronic Disease. We'll get to that book in a moment. So, Dean, you've been an early pioneer in the whole diet and reversal of heart disease, long before we knew anything about the microbiome and all of that. So apparently now we are told that any food that is refined, manufactured, processed, has too much sugar, chemicals, antibiotics, hormones, steroids, you name it, all the factory produced food, and not only meat and other stuff, but just about anything that comes from a factory is going to kill our microbiome and inflame it. I'm told that 30% of the microbiome actually has disappeared from urban societies. Dysbiosis is a big factor in just about every disease. Has your initial take on diet been influenced with all this knowledge about the microbiome? I'm involved in some of these studies where we look at the microbiome before and after people change their diet. What is a little remarkable to me, and maybe I I may be mistaken, but what I'm understanding is you can change 99% of the genetic information in your body, which is microbial, just by diet, number one. And the 1% or less, which is human, the 25,000 genes that you have human, 2 million microbial, you can upgrade them as you showed them in your studies, which means you can change almost more than 99% of genetic information, which means if genetic information is the symbolic representation of life and the printout for this body, we can change our body. That's what I've been experimenting this 1 year with my own body. I've lost, over the last 5 years, 50 pounds. My biomarkers right now, blood pressure is 110 over 70, cholesterol is less than 100, heart rate variability goes up to 80 at night. I'm having a very good time, but is it true that we can change our genetic background almost in the way I expressed, or am I exaggerating?
No, I continually am impressed by how dynamic these mechanisms are in both directions. You can get better quickly, you can get worse quickly. We showed, as we talked about, we could change gene expression. When I say gene expression, there's switches that turn genes on and off, as you know, called methylation or histone and non-histone proteins and so on. They act like switches. So if you can turn off a gene that causes prostate cancer, or if you can turn off a gene that causes inflammation or oxidative stress or so on, it's going to have far-reaching implications, not just with heart disease and diabetes, but a wide range of, and you've outlined some of them, ranging from autoimmune diseases like lupus to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, early stage prostate cancer. What's true for prostate cancer will likely be true for breast cancer, and so on. We've done studies with Rob Knight at UCSD, who's one of the leading lights in the microbiome. We were on a panel together in Davos years ago and became friends. And so he's doing microbiome studies of the Alzheimer's patients. So we're looking at not only their changes in cognitive function, which is our primary measure, but changes in their telomeres in Liz Blackburn's lab. Shorter telomeres have been associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's and pretty much everything else. We found for the first time we could actually lengthen telomeres. And when we published in the Lancet, they called it reversing aging at a cellular level. We're looking at the changes in the microbiome, the 100 trillion cells that live in our guts. We have more cells living inside us that are not us than those that are us. And just to digress for a moment, one of the studies I did, 40 years ago that I never published was, since I'm talking to Deepak Chopra, I have to ask you this, that the language that immunologists use and mystics use are very much the same. They both talk about self and not self. And I've always wondered if you could, the problem with autoimmune diseases, as you know, is your body gets confused and they think that part of yourself is really not self, and so attacks it. If it's in your, depending on where it is, if it's in your, your sweat glands, it might be Sjogren's. If it's in your joints, it might be rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or whatever. But it's the same confusion of what's self and not self. And so I wondered if someone could have a transcendent experience through meditation. And as you know, meditation is not just managing stress, but can give you that double vision that the Swami talked about, that on one level we're separate, you're you and I'm me. On another level, we're part of everything that and everyone around us. He liked the metaphor of an old style movie theater where the light goes through the film and the movie projector, and all these names and forms are on the screen, but it's still the light behind it. And if you can see both and not get caught in either one, then you can lead a much more fun and less stressful life. And so I wondered if we could help people have that direct experience of non-duality, of transcendence. In other words, if everything is self and nothing is not self, would that affect autoimmune disease where there's nothing to attack? And sure enough, we found that the lupus markers got better. I never published that. I never pursued it. It just seemed too weird at the time for people to really accept. But who knows? We might get back to that at some point. But I think these things are really powerful and really dynamic. And the spiritual teachers will say the disease actually begins in your aura, your etheric field before it becomes in your physical. By the time you have a physical disease, it's been going on for quite some time. Think about a boat that starts to get off course. If you catch it early, you can bring it back fairly easily. If you wait, it can go thousands of miles out to sea. And so it becomes much harder to reverse something than it does to prevent it. But these things all interact. And so if we show we can improve cognitive function in people with Alzheimer's, and then we can look at is there any correlation with their change in telomeres, with their gene expression, with their microbiome, with inflammatory markers that Rudy's doing, and so on, and tau markers and other things like that. That'll give us more insight into some of the mechanisms by which these changes occur. But the changes, the mechanisms we know so much about already, and they're so influenced for better and for worse by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, how much love and support we have. But more important is how much, the love that we have for ourselves and for others, to the extent that we view ourselves as separate and only separate, then that creates a lot of suffering. My teacher used to say, there's a causal chain of events that leads to something. And the farther back in that chain you go, the more powerful the healing can be. And in my limited understanding, the idea that we are separate and only separate is really a root cause of so many behaviors and the sense of loneliness and isolation and depression and alienation that to me are often at the root of the behaviors. I'd ask people in our studies, like, why do you smoke? Why do you overeat? Why do you drink too much? Why do you abuse opioids? Why do you play so many video games? These behaviors seem so maladaptive. And they'd say, they're not maladaptive. You don't get it. You don't have a clue, Dean. These behaviors are very adaptive because they help us deal with our pain, our loneliness, our depression. They'll say things like, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes and they're always there for me and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends, what are you going to give me? Or food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or alcohol numbs the pain, opioids numb the pain, other drugs numb the pain, working all the time distracts me from my pain, video games distract me from my pain. And so I've just learned that information is important, but it's not usually enough to motivate people to make lasting changes. We have to work at a deeper level. And when we take it deep enough, it usually comes to that place of feeling separate and only separate and lonely and depressed and isolated because of that. The kinds of things that I struggle with when I was 19, I think we're seeing so much as that's really the epidemic in our culture. It's not just COVID, it's these factors as well.
So, we've always heard the phrase love heals. I used to think it's metaphoric till I actually saw some very interesting studies on neuroscience where when you have extreme empathy for a person, then there's something called limbic resonance between the healer and the healed. And if you stay in that place of empathy and compassion, then there's something called limbic regulation. Your emotions and the person who's you're healing, so to speak, they start to resonate. And then the third is limbic revision. Neural networks actually rewire to induce self-regulation or homeostasis. So that's love. I mean,
Yes.
that was beautiful when I first heard it. But I want to focus on that last part, the formless being, um, mystical experience and self-regulation. But before I do that, because I'm going to share with you my own personal experience this last 12 months. But before we do that, tell us about the book you and your wife wrote and why should everybody be reading it, which I have read, but I think everybody else should be reading it as well.
Thank you.
Talk to us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, what you talk about limbic is also the mirror neurons is another way of looking at that as well. We're already interconnected. And
Okay.
I think that anything that creates isolation creates suffering and ultimately illness. Anything that creates intimacy or healing, intimacy is really healing. Even the word healing comes from the root to make whole. Yoga, as you know, comes from the word to yoke, to unite, union. These are really old ideas that we're rediscovering and reappreciating. And so I think, when Nelson Mandela did his long walk to freedom after he'd been released from jail, he said, "Do you hate your jailers?" He said, "Well, they took away the best years of my life. I was in jail for like 16 years, but if I still hate them, I'm in prison in my heart." And so all these spiritual truths that, that we end up, putting into religions that people fight and kill each other over. But when you get to the root of it, what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, love and compassion and forgiveness and altruism, these are not things that we do just to get good karma or get a good star or a gold star, for some external reward, but that's what frees us from our suffering and our illness. And I think people with heart disease often find that, and in fact, the one emotion that's been shown to be consistently linked with heart disease is chronic anger. And they did a study of over 2 million tweets, and those that were in Twitter, those had the most anger associated with them were the people who had the most heart disease, just as one of many examples of that. So when you're angry with someone, it's hurting you. When you forgive somebody, it doesn't excuse or condone what they've done, but it frees you from that suffering. So the book that my wife Ann and I wrote, and we've been together for over 20 years now, she's an amazing, amazing person. It was designed to put into one place everything that we've learned in doing this for so many decades, and to really build it around this unifying theory of radical simplicity, that that all these different conditions, as we talked about earlier, are just variations on a theme. They're just the same disease manifesting and masquerading in different forms. And so instead of saying, gosh, I need to have one diet for this disease and this another diet for that disease and this kind of meditation for that, another for that, it just radically simplifies it. Steve Jobs used to say, I'm more proud of what I left out of the iPhone than what I put in it. That when you really have that deep understanding, of the people who don't know anything about something and the people who spend their whole lives doing it can make it radically simple, one out of ignorance and one out of a deep understanding. So we try to make it radically simple. It says, look, eat well, move more, stress less, love more. Boom, that's it. All the rest is really commentary. And to the degree that you move in that direction, there's a corresponding benefit. You're going to look better, feel better, all the things that really matter to you, and how quickly you can experience that. And then it comes out of your own experience, and it takes you out of the diet wars of it this or is it that. You begin to really see in just a week or two how much better you feel, and then you really know from your own experience.
So that's the book. Undo It, Simplify Your Life, Reverse Chronic Illness, Love and Enjoy a Joyful, Energetic Body, Loving, Compassionate Heart, Lightness of Being. That's Dean's message, with a wonderful wife as co-author. And Dean is a pioneer in this whole field. Look up to him. He's a mentor. Please read the book. So, Dean, I wanted to share something with you because you
Please.
brought it up: awareness, spiritual experience, self regulation. What is the self? What is the non self?
Yes, indeed.
So, all our great masters, gurus from the wisdom traditions have always said that there is only consciousness and everything else is actually just a disguised form of awareness. So, in this last 1 year, what I started to go through was the classic Ayurvedic model: physical body, subtle body, causal body, physical body, matter and energy, subtle body, mind, intellect, ego, causal body, jiva, Atman, Brahman, whatever. And so I went through personally a reflection on, is my body a physical thing? And I came to the conclusion, as the mystical masters have said, no, it's not. It's a perceptual activity in my consciousness. The fact that I call it physical is a human construct. Then I said, is it energy? And, mass is equal to energy. Yes, it's energy, but even energy is a human construct, for what does work, or mass is equal to energy. Then I said, is it information? And the answer was, yeah, it is information. Every molecule is an informational molecule. DNA is information. Epigenetics is information. Microbiome is information. Apoptosis, whatever. It's all information. That's pretty good. But what is information? It's the resolution of uncertainty where? In consciousness. So information is also a derivative of consciousness. So then finally I said to myself, I'm going to look at my body as only consciousness, nothing other. And of course, consciousness has no form. You can't see it. And the reason you can't see it, it doesn't have any boundaries, so it's formless. Being formless, it must be infinite. And so, why not think of my body as formless and infinite and just focus on that one experience? Formless, infinite, boundless, borderless, without cause. And now I can morph it into what I want.
Mm.
So I did. I morphed it into this. This took me a little bit, but I followed all the stuff you talk about. But the fundamental inside secret for me was he's made out of nothing, so I can make anything out of it. And, all that bagel stuff and the microbiome, it all fit in: sleep, stress management, yoga, breathing, exercise, emotions, love, diet, regulation of biological rhythms. But most importantly, I spent this last year at least 2 to 4 hours every day in sadhana,
Mm.
and at night in reflecting about the mystery of my death, because I'm now 74. That has to be the next chapter. And I can't tell you how joyful I
Mm.
became. And your guru was called Satchitananda. That's what I'm experiencing. Sat, the truth of
Existence,
existence.
knowledge, bliss, absolute.
That's my body. That's the body. And
Mm.
I'm just hoping if we could teach this to other people, what an adventure it would be.
Well, see, that's to me why I do this work. Because I feel like I've been on borrowed time since I was 19. I barely, I came about as close to doing myself in as you can without doing it, which is very liberating in many ways. Because I feel like what's the worst that can happen? I'll learn something, right? And I knew that I wanted to, at the end of my life, feel like if I made any mistakes, I'd rather the ones I did that I regret. I didn't want to have any regrets of things I didn't do. I figured if I do something and it doesn't turn out well, then that's great too. I'll learn from that, but I didn't want to just wonder. And so I'm wondering, but I am curious about what do you do for 2 or 4 hours every day as part of your sadhana?
So I've become very disciplined about yoga. But in the past, when I did yoga, 1 hour or sometimes even 2 hours, I did it so I could get over it. I'm going to do yoga and then I can catch up with something else. Now, what I did was I actually immersed myself in yoga and breathing, but with awareness. As you know, the yogasanas are called yogasana. Asana is seat of awareness. So I brought awareness to every asana. I did deep pranayam. I did all the kriyas for vagal stimulation and a lot of reflection. Who am I? What do I want? What's my purpose? What am I grateful for? But most importantly, what is existence? And it's something I've thought of for 40 years, but I totally immersed myself. And there are days, honestly, and people would think what a boring guy, but there are days when I do 8 hours of sadhana, 8 hours of work, and 8 hours of sleep, nothing else.
Hmm.
And so that was, when I wake up in the morning, I'm buzzing as if I had taken a drug. But I know I haven't taken anything. It's just the buzz of joy. Satchitananda. That's what I did.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I mean, I think both of us do this work as part of what I call the conspiracy of love, that
Yes.
you gave this, I mentioned earlier, the farther back in this causal chain you go, the more powerful the healing can be. And you outlined very beautifully this, all these things that led to this, to this, to this, to this. But now you're kind of dealing at the source, at
Yeah.
the at least in my limited experience, the most primal aspect. But I'm curious to know that's a big commitment. What motivated you to do that when you could be doing so many other things?
Dean, I come from a tradition, and I'm actually very traditionalist. First 25 years, you educate. Second 25 years, fame and fortune. Third 25 years, you give back.
Hmm.
And now I'm entering the final phase, which is self-realization. So for me, actually very joyful to just think of falling in love with the self, with the big self.
Hmm.
So that's what made me do it.
Wow.
I'm entering my fourth phase.
Was there any, I'm always interested in what motivates people to change. Was there any specific event, or was it turning 74, or what was it that
Yeah,
made
yeah,
you change?
74. Turning 70 was big for me. And then suddenly I realized I'm 74. My God, it's the way it's just, they say in the Vedanta, time is the consumer and we are its food. So we are being consumed by this thing called time. So I decided, let me focus on that which is timeless.
Well, you've inspired me. Now I'm going to go back and do my practices more than I have been. So thank you for that
So
inspiration.
once again, thank you for being here.